Okay, welcome back everyone to session 6, Patents and Innovation Industries. We've had an intro to patent law. We've heard a little bit about the economics of IP. We've had an intro to patent prosecution and an intro to patent litigation. Now we're going to hear from some representatives of industries where patents are of significant importance, about what patent rights mean to them, their companies, their industries, and why we should care about them. So I'm going to start with the first question, go through each of the panelists and let them primarily introduce themselves as they answer the first question. And I have a couple of questions prepared, and we can go for the whole hour and a half with me asking questions, but I think this would be a more interesting session if you start asking questions. So please feel free to start typing questions in the chat. Once we've gone through our first intro question or two, we'll turn to the chat and start answering your questions. So let's start by talking about how development and commercialization of patented innovations is achieved. Talk a little bit about the business model for your company or industry and the role of patents, again, for your company or industry. We'll have a couple of minutes for each. And why don't we start with Lori Self of Qualcomm.
Thank you. So just quickly, I'm Laurie Self. I'm a Senior Vice President and Counsel with Qualcomm's Government Affairs team based in Washington. I help lead our policy work in the US and internationally and have a particular focus on patent policy issues. So just to answer Josh's question, I think it's important to take a step back and understand that different companies use patent rights differently. Companies like Qualcomm use patent rights as a means of incentivizing and justifying and ultimately commercializing years and years of advanced research and development. Our function as a company is to essentially serve as the R&D arm of the mobile communications industry. So we date back to 1985. Most of you, or many of you, were not born at that point in time, but it was a period where you were starting to see this move, if you will, this transition from analog telecommunications to cellular, wireless, digital communications. And of course, the devices you now are dependent upon are the culmination of decades of advanced R&D that drove those both evolutionary shifts in technology and revolutionary shifts in technology. For a company like Qualcomm, we self-fund all of that R&D. It does not come from the government. And the only way we can justify those many years of pre-commercial, pre-competitive R&D is a strong patent system. So we patent our rights, or we patent our technology. Our goal, again, is to serve as kind of the R&D arm for the industry. So we license that technology broadly. It's also contributed to what we call standards, technology standards, which create an opportunity for global communications, global interoperable platforms of communications and all forms of technological functionality. And we then license the technology to the major device makers in the world. So that's about 6 companies that are responsible for the vast majority of our patent revenues. And that revenue is what we pump back into that R&D engine. So it's a kind of what some describe as a sort of virtuous or innovation cycle that is, again, dependent on the patent system. I also think it's worth noting that today in the United States, about 70 to 80% of R&D investments in critical technology spaces are funded by the private sector. So in other words, you have to have a sustainable, stable system of patent rights to ensure R&D investments in a lot of critically important technologies today, with cellular communications, telecommunications being one critical example. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lori. Let's turn to John Kolakowski of Nokia for a somewhat similar, but a little bit different take on things.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. Yeah, I think a lot of what you'll hear from us will sound similar to what you just heard from Lori with respect to Qualcomm. My name is John Kolakowski, and I'm with Nokia Technologies. I have two roles there. On the one hand, I'm actively involved in out-licensing our patent portfolio, particularly in the multimedia space. And on the other hand, I spend a lot of my time as the head of IP regulatory policy for North America. And in that position, I advocate on behalf of Nokia before standard setting organizations, government regulatory bodies, lawmakers, and others who are impacting patent policies that could impact our business and our modes of operation. So typically, what I'm doing in those instances is advocating on behalf of strong patent rights to make sure that we can continue to monetize the patent portfolio that we've developed. So just turning to the background of Nokia for a moment, we were established in 1865 as a single paper mill in Finland. And over the last 155 plus years, we've had multiple business transformations from that original paper producing start. At various times, we've produced rubber boots, televisions, undersea cables, car tires, and eventually to where we are now, producing state-of-the-art wireless and wired communication products. Indeed, we were the world's largest seller of mobile phones from 1998 to 2012, and that's where a lot of people first became familiar with Nokia. But we'd always not provided just cellular phones, but also the infrastructure that enabled communication service providers to build the networks that people around the world use today to do their communication. Over the years, Nokia grew that business, and with consolidation in the industry, we now stand as one of really probably three worldwide providers of infrastructure equipment, along with a Swedish company called Ericsson and to a lesser degree, the Korean company Samsung. The business model today for us is to produce and sell that infrastructure equipment along with related software and services. Through development of those products and the related research that's necessary to constantly evolve and improve the products, we are constantly innovating. Those innovations result in patents, many, many patents. Nokia has one of the 20 largest patent portfolios in the world. Currently, we hold more than 20,000 patent families, most with several family members filed in various countries. Around 4,000 of those patents are declared essential to one or more telecommunications or video standards, with the most familiar standards that you've probably heard of being Wi-Fi, 2G, 3G, 4G, and the most recent rollout, 5G. On the video side, it's primarily for the most widely used compression codecs that enable video streaming, like H.264 and H.265, commonly known, the latter commonly known as HEVC. And of course, H.266 VVC, which is currently the next generation. Being one of the top holders of essential patents, many patents in our portfolio are necessarily infringed by companies that manufacture and sell products that utilize the communication and video standards. So cellular smartphones, tablets, and other devices, connected automobiles, smart televisions, the things that make up the Internet of Things, over-the-top video streaming services like Netflix and Max and others. We have well-developed patent licensing programs in which we negotiate with the producers of those devices, and we reach licensing agreements in which they pay us royalties for the use of the technology. That licensing revenue is in turn plowed back into our R&D efforts to help generate the next communications technologies and standards. We have innovation centers in 17 different countries. Many of our roughly 85,000 employees worldwide are involved in research and development. We've reinvested some 150 billion euros and counting into our research and development since the year 2000. And that's about roughly 15 to 20% of our revenue each year. That licensing revenue is vital to our viability as a company. And as Lori mentioned, it's part of this virtuous circle or cycle, depending how you look at it, of R&D leading to patents, which then we are able to monetize, which leads to revenue that we can then plow back into our R&D to generate more patents for the next cycle of technology. So in a nutshell, that's Nokia, and that's what we do and how patents play an important role in that. Thanks, Joshua.
Thank you very much, John. Let's turn to Hans Sauer's bio to hear about the biotechnology industry.
Yes, so good morning. Thank you for having me. Thanks to WIPO also for having me. And of course, all you students from all around the world. I always really enjoy meeting students like you, from all over the place across the globe, because, inside biotech, I think we've long been very interested in, enabling innovation wherever it occurs. And, since the world is facing a lot of problems, having to do not just with pandemics or human health, but also with nutrition, with environmental challenges, the growing of industrial bases all around the developing world. There are a lot of challenges that biotech can make a contribution towards solving. So it's great to see you all. I think innovation is just going to be an incredibly important aspect of dealing with the greatest crises of the coming generations. And we can't afford for innovation to just happen in a couple of countries around the world, right? It feels wasteful to have so much of the world contribute less and participate less in innovation than they could. And which brings me to the patent system and to biotech. So a few words about myself and where I'm from. So I'm Hans Sauer. I'm Vice President for Intellectual Property for the Biotechnology Industry Organization. And so we are a US-based industry association for the entire US biotechnology industry. Many foreign companies that are not US-based are also members of bio, because the US market is so very important, for innovative companies wherever they might arise. But we're predominantly a US-based trade association. We have over 1,000 member companies that are part of bio and that feed us information, give us instructions and their own proposals on how to best advocate for them so that they can have a good, sustainable business that produces innovation in biotech. Again, not just in health, but also in agricultural biotechnology, drought and pest-resistant seeds and food crops are an important aspect of modern biotechnology, and industrial biotechnology as well, right? The fermentation of biofuels, the creation of industrial enzymes in industrial production that allow for cheaper and less pollution-heavy modes of chemical manufacturing. All this, is something that biotech can make a contribution to. It may sound like a very diverse industry, right, inside biotech, but it really isn't. I think it's unified by similarities in their business model. And of course, they use the same technology, right? A company that may make a modern biological medicine may use much the same kinds of chemical and biological processes and techniques as a company that makes an industrial enzyme for biofuel production, right? So there's more similarity among the companies in our space than one would think, even though they operate in very different sectors. So about patents. Biotech, by and large, is a very patent and intellectual property dependent industry. And I think it's important to lay out that so many people think of patents as something that large companies get, right? Large companies get lots of patents and then they use them to sue each other and to really fight these colossal battles in industry. But that's really not the typical picture, right? Most patents, the vast majority of all patents in the world, are never litigated, right? They're actually relatively rarely subject to disputes. They don't operate as a weapon in, if you will, commercial wars. They much more operate as a tool for companies to engage in the orderly dissemination of technology and accessing capital, in partnering, licensing. You heard John Kolakowski, who spoke before me, about the importance of their licensing system. And you might have noticed, John wasn't talking very much about litigating against people and suing and fighting these colossal court battles. But what John talked about was licensing and the orderly dissemination of new technology, a proper partnering, and mutual recognition and reward for developing technology. That's what patents facilitate, right? They are a tool of orderly commerce and rules-based trading, from my perspective, at least. Few words on something that you heard Laurie Self say earlier. Right? Laurie told you that patents work a little bit differently depending on what kind of business model you have. What kind of technology do you work with? How does your business even work? Right? And in biotech, one thing that's very common across the different sectors of biotech is long development times. So a biotech product, whether it's a new medicine or a new agricultural, drought-resistant seed, they take quite a long time to develop. Many high-tech products, like you heard from Laurie and John, also take a really long time to mature and take a lot of work. And the same is true in biotech as well. So for us, from like conception until a product may be approved for human use or for use by farmers, easily 10 to 15 years can pass from idea to a market-ready product, right? So it's a relatively long process of bringing a product to market. It's an expensive process. I want to leave some for my colleague David Korn, who will speak after me. He will tell you something about the expense of bringing a new drug to the market, which means if it's expensive, it also means you need to raise a lot of capital. So you have to go to investors. You have to find investors. You have to find partners. You have to find people to give you money, especially if you're a small company, because you're not making a lot of money on your own, right? You can depend on other people's money. And other people, before they give you money, investors, this is certainly my experience when I was still inside biotech companies, are very, very rational and are very, very strict about wanting to know, if we fund your company, do you have a proper level of IP protection, intellectual property protection for your technology? Because we as investors don't want to give you a lot of money, end up funding the development of technology that then gets, if you will, stolen by somebody else who makes all the money. And we don't recoup our investment. So investors are rather stringent about the need for intellectual property protection among the small companies that they're being approached by to give them money. Right? So it's expensive, access to capital. Development is risky. My colleague David Korn will tell you something about the risks, right? Because most products in biotechnology and in pharmaceutical technology, most products that are being put into development actually fail at some point in development. It is not a high success kind of business. If I told you that 90% of our investigational products fail and never make it to the market, some people might say that doesn't sound like a very good kind of business, right? If you succeed only 10% of the time, it's not a very good investment proposition. Well, but if you succeed, it makes a real difference, both to human health and to further advances in biomedical or agricultural technology. I would also say, as part of the biotech business model, that the product that, if they're developed successfully and they reach the market, are also typically very long-lived in the marketplace. So we today take medicines, we use agricultural products and seed products that are 20, 30 years old. What? They've been around for a really long time. They're still perfectly good products. But they have, my point is only that they have a very long time in the marketplace before they become superseded by new technology. It is one of the big efforts in the life sciences to accelerate the innovation cycle, because it does feel like it is too slow to be able to bring a new drug to market only every 10 to 12 years, if at all. So accelerating the path of product development is going to be very important to us. But for intellectual property purposes, I think what I'd like you to take away is that patents, certainly in the biotechnology industry, are not a tool for litigating and fighting commercial wars. They're a tool for partnering. They're a tool for raising capital, moving investigational products up the value chain from one company that specializes perhaps like in early phase development to another company that is very good at clinical development. And from there, it may go to another biomedical company, the same product, to another biomedical company, which is very good at manufacturing, building supply and distribution chains, and getting FDA approval. It's a division of work that is very characteristic of the biotech industry. And you can imagine, right, when a lot of people have to work together in stages of a program, then it becomes really important to have an orderly transfer of technology up the value chain. And that's what patents do for us. Patents are this very unusual legal instrument that allow us to capture something that's otherwise quite intangible, right? A smart idea, know-how, things that you figured out. Patents allow us to capture this, right, in a proper enforceable legal instrument that everybody can read, that we can understand, that we can transfer, that we can borrow money on, and that we can do business with. And so some people have called, for biotech purposes, patents are like the grease, right, that makes the engine work for biotechnological innovation. They play a really important role for us, and I look forward to discussing that with you more. Joshua, back to you.
Thank you very much, Hans. And finishing up, our opening question, David Korn from Pharma.
Thanks, Joshua, and thanks to my fellow panelists. So some of you may not be familiar with Pharma, but we are a trade association, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. So like bio, we're composed of companies in the pharmaceutical sector. Our companies, we represent leading biopharmaceutical research and manufacturing companies. So all of our companies are engaged in both research and providing medicines to patients. We advocate on behalf of our members on public policy issues that support innovation in biopharmaceuticals, including IP issues, as IP is very critical to the companies. And I don't work for any particular company. So I'm here taking an industry view. So like others here, as Hans mentioned, we are a research-intensive industry. So what does that mean? Well, our members invested nearly $101 billion in 2022 alone in the search for new treatments and cures. And the products can be known as drugs, biologics, vaccines, any number of biopharmaceutical products, but all human products for patients, products for human patients. So the biopharmaceutical R&D process is different than the ones you heard about from Qualcomm and Nokia, my fellow panelists. So it's difficult science, like in those sectors, but the regulatory approval process is more unique than in other sectors. So what's involved? Because this is why we have a distinct need for IP as part of this process. So the process begins with basic science research. That could be done by NIH. It could be done by our companies. It could be done by the smaller companies that Hans and Bio represent. And some of that could be financed by NIH. But because NIH does very limited research relating to advancing basic science into useful products, without the investment of private companies and the scientific expertise of the companies, knowledge resulting from the basic research would generate many ideas for potential drugs and drug targets for action, but very few new medicines. So patents make licensing in this ecosystem possible, and strong and reliable patents are providing the basis for people to invest these billions of dollars. So as Hans mentioned, this process is lengthy, it's costly and risky, and that's why IP is an important incentive. So companies can test many compounds, and the failure rate is very high. For each approved medicine, there could have been thousands considered that didn't make it through the process. So after discovering a potential compound, that's a potential compound. That's not a medicine. That's not a drug. It's just a compound with hopes. So one needs to consider whether it has the biological activity that you're looking for in treating or preventing a disease, whether it's safe to be given to patients, how you could even administer that to patients to test. So they first tested in labs in animals and also in chemical type testing. And then after it's shown to be safe in that context, they seek permission from FDA to begin the process of testing it in humans. And these are called clinical trials. And these trials happen in multiple phases over time. They start small with testing that's a small group for safety. Can a human tolerate the product if it's ultimately approved? And some fail. If successful, it can go to a study where they give it to patients in a very small group to see whether it also has the effectiveness or efficacy to treat what's hoped for. And only then, if it's successful, then it expands to what we call phase 3 studies that involve thousands of patients at different sites, different medical schools, different hospitals. And that involves full testing for safety and efficacy in particular diseases. And at each phase, potential compounds fail. So less than 12% of the drug candidates that start the clinical testing make it into an approved product by FDA. And if it's successful, then a company can submit what's known as a new drug application or NDA, or a biologics license application or BLA for a biologic medicine. So once these applications are submitted, FDA gives a careful review to determine whether it's safe and effective for the particular uses. And FDA can reject products, they can approve products, they can be changing what it's useful for patients over time. And only then, after it's approved by FDA, can it be marketed for patients to be using it. So it takes 10 to 15 years to go from discovery of a compound to FDA approval. And when you look at across all the products and you factor in the cost of failures over time, the estimates that it cost on average $2.6 billion to develop a single medicine. And even then, that's not a guarantee that the medicine would be successful and even earn back the cost of R&D. But it's the revenue from the marketed product that is then fed back into more research, because as I mentioned, there's so much research that's funded by the biopharmaceutical industry. So where do patents fit in? Well, if you're going to take 10 to 15 years and you're going to invest on average $2.6 billion, you want to be able to recoup your investment and also find ways to fund future research into either improvements to the medicine, new medicines overall, and new classes of drugs. There are all sorts of things that people can think about. And you could have patents on different types of aspects of the medicine. And one of the interesting things about our space is you don't necessarily see different functionality like you might in a mechanical device, electronic device, but it's there. You've got an active ingredient that somebody invented, and that's not a drug. As I mentioned, you have to figure out how to give it to somebody. And even then, how do you make it? And what's it useful for? They're all different technologies and inventions that happen over time for the products that we could talk about later. And one of the unique aspects of biopharmaceuticals is at the end of the patent life, there's a process for approving generic drugs or biosimilar drugs, and we can talk about that later, but where the regulatory system encourages people to copy the product and come out with less expensive versions. And we could talk about that later in the panel. So I'll turn it back to Joshua.
Thank you very much, David. See, we have a good number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn to them for now and maybe get back to some of our other questions later if we have time. So the first question, which is sort of two parts, is how do your industries or companies decide what areas to focus R&D on? And then for patents you get, it's fairly expensive to maintain them. How do you decide in a portfolio what patents are worth maintaining and potentially licensing or using? Which ones do you let go? And I'll open this up to whoever wants to start.
I'll start, and maybe John, you can build off of my comments since we're both in the same sector. So again, Qualcomm, like Nokia, our technology R&D efforts are focused on cellular communications, which are kind of the foundation of your mobile communications, what's now 5G, what will ultimately be 6G. We also have a broad range of related technologies, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, video, et cetera, now AI, of course. So you have to kind of think about these R&D investments and our patent portfolio as funding a kind of technology ecosystem, if you will, which starts in the company, but is meant to be responsive to how the technology needs to evolve over a period of years. So we are kind of looking at the technology as it exists today, and then thinking about what do we want that in technology to enable 5, 10, 20 years from now. So part of our function as a company is to really map out that future, what the technology can enable, and then to create the innovations that make that vision, if you will, a reality. So that's kind of a big picture approach to what we do. Obviously, on a more granular basis, that is, thousands of engineers working on thousands of different areas of technology. Qualcomm is also a leader in semiconductor design. So there's a synergy between what we're doing at the foundational technology level and what we're doing at the semiconductor component level. And then obviously, again, now, as we think about what 5G will enable, looking across all the different industry sectors, all the different use cases that will now leverage that technology. So that's kind of a big picture, I think, answer to the question. But what it speaks to is a very dynamic focus on innovation, a very dynamic focus on improving the state of the technology and ensuring that it can create a kind of springboard for new industries, new use cases, obviously keeping top of mind, how do we make this technology as valuable and beneficial and impactful as possible? We also work, as does Nokia and others, we work super closely across our own industry in what are called standards organizations, which bring together engineers from around the world who are trying to understand what the technology will comprise, what it will enable, how different parts of our economy can benefit from it. And again, these are global organizations. But I think it's worth noting that it's really a handful of companies in our space, including Qualcomm and Nokia, that are doing the vast majority of the R&D investments. And then we're working across those different companies and industries that will leverage the technology to make sure that it's as beneficial as possible. In terms of how we make decisions about, I think the second part of the question, Joshua, was how do we make decisions about what we patent, or
it's what you patent, and also what patents you continue to pay for and keep for the life, and what patents you let expire.
Yeah, so we have about 160,000 issued and pending patents. Again, those are patent rights across the globe. Candidly, I don't know if we make a decision to allow certain patents to to be abandoned. I don't think that's part of our kind of typical model. What I would focus on more is, as we think about which of our patented technologies do we need to license in order to enable that ecosystem, in order to enable the standard to kind of become that global technological blueprint. Those are technologies that we patent. There's a constant, decision process within our engineering and intellectual property team about, do we keep certain inventions as trade secrets, but if the focus of a technology is to become part of a standard, to become part of a kind of broader technological blueprint, then we patent that technology and we include it within that portfolio that we in turn license. I would kind of think about it in that way. How will that technology be leveraged? Does it need to be leveraged or used broadly? And if so, then we patent it and create an opportunity to license. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add?
I'll build on to Lori's answer. On the what do you patent question, the simplest answer is to say that we have people in our organization who are tasked with nothing else other than futuristic thinking. These are people researchers, economists, and others who are part of our strategy division that keep an eye on the pulse of technology. They try to look for trends in the marketplace and elsewhere to suggest which way communications technology is heading. And we then try to focus our research and development efforts in those areas. Nokia, through an acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent several years ago, is now the owner of the famous Bell Labs research entity based in New Jersey in the United States. This is an outfit that does some groundbreaking and world-leading research. And we have many technologists and strategizers there who are at the forefront of research in the areas that we focus on. And our strategists will work with them to try to determine which way the technology is going and where we should focus our efforts and our money in terms of funding the research that we need to continue to innovate and to continue to develop patents. Now, once we have all these patents, how do we decide what we're going to keep? Because as the questioners noted, it's very expensive to maintain patents. There are rights that you have to continue to pay for as the patent ages, once it's issued, different points in its life cycle. And what we do is those same people who keep an eye on the future trends are also working with our product development people and others within our company to decide to make sure that we understand what technology is actually being used and which of our technologies are being employed in products, either in our own or in competitors' products, or in other products elsewhere in the market that we think we might be able to license. And if it looks like there's an employment of the technology, then generally we're going to keep it. But a lot of times, some of our technology, some of our patents that we obtain where we think the technology is going to go one way, it ends up diverging and going a different way. And we find that some of the intellectual property that we obtained is no longer useful or likely to be used. in general, then a decision is oftentimes made either to abandon those patents and allow them to lapse, or alternatively, we may seek to divest them to others, to other companies, or to other monetization outfits who think that they might be able to actually gain revenue from either licensing or using the patents. So it's all about monetization of the IP that you obtain. Allowing it to lapse would be a last resort, but one that is sometimes taken because there's only so much money that the company has allocated toward its patent portfolio, and we don't have unlimited funds. What we found is the current size that we have seems to be ideal for our needs. And so generally, we're trying to keep it at the level that we're at, but simultaneously, we're obtaining new patents every year. So in order to keep the overall size of the portfolio where it is, we generally have to make hard decisions each year about technologies that we want to let go of. And so we try to keep it at roughly a consistent level of overall IP rights that we own.
Thank you. David and Hans, if you have anything to add, and I'll throw out a slight tweak on the question for you. If, let's say, clinical trial startup fails for some reason, is that a reason to abandon, or is there reasons to keep the patent anyway? And have there been benefits to keeping them even after a presumed failure early on?
A quick word on that. I would say generally, if an investigational product fails somewhere along the path of development, say in a clinical trial, I think in my experience, that is usually not a reason to abandon the underlying intellectual property, at least not quickly. Right? Because we have many instances in the industry where products that at first failed eventually were turned around and turned out like to actually be useful products, right, and reach the marketplace, and so on. Even just defining failure is not often an easy thing, right? For some businesses, a so-called failed trial may be one that just didn't meet their high expectations of what the product would do. And you can call that a failure, and you say, well, we're no longer going to invest in this because it won't fit into our projections. And so that doesn't mean that some other company isn't willing to give it a shot to see if they can optimize the product, maybe turn this thing around. And they're like, in fact, there are businesses, biotech companies in the United States that almost specialize in that kind of work. They acquire assets from other companies that other companies no longer want to develop for whatever reason, and one reason may be perceived failure, and they take it on and they take another run at it, if you will, put another 5 years of work into it. And then we've seen instances where these small companies then went back to the larger company and said, look what we did. Right? We turned this around, and as part of our transaction, right, we got the patents from you. We worked on the technology. Now we're returning the technology to you, only better, right? And the patents come back with it. It's another example of what I was saying earlier about how patents facilitate, I think, a lot of transactional work and grease the wheels of biotech innovation. So I would say, no, it's not necessarily, and I think more often than not, it's not a reason to abandon the intellectual property. David, right? And then we can say a little more about how we decide what to research and what to patent. But David, first you.
That's where I was going to pick up. So
go ahead.
Companies follow the science. So they may be looking at a product for one type of use where they think there's an unmet need for patients. And that would be a place to channel their efforts. But they might find out there's perhaps another unmet need in a different class of therapy, a different type of disease. Like looking at one cancer and figuring out, actually, no, maybe this is actually better for a different type of cancer. And there's some products that are in totally different areas where they've been found to be effective. So companies can do that. Companies can also, they don't necessarily need to be the first in the marketplace in a class of drugs. Sometimes that's useful, But you could think of products that maybe you've taken where it wasn't the first, it's the second. We look at products like statins for cholesterol, and there were many innovator products and they got better. I mean, people found a reason to take newer products because they had a better profile for patients for certain types of patients. And so they could be looking at it, looking at the marketplace, medical need, as well as following science in their own products or others.
I would add to that, I think there's an interesting phenomenon. I think that has to do with the state of the, as David said, following the science. It has to do with the state of the underlying science. So sometimes it is perfectly evident that there's a real big unmet medical need, say, for a new medicine in some rare disease, right? There are close to 10,000 like unusual rare diseases known to mankind, only a fraction of which have any treatment at all, right? So it's easy to find unmet needs, unmet medical needs, at least in the biopharmaceutical space. But the underlying science isn't there, right? So the National Institutes of Health or whatever, universities all around the world may be studying at some level of effort certain kinds of problems, maybe studying biology. Right, but often, people have to wait for a breakthrough, have to wait for a maturing of the science. And before that happens, even the biggest unmet needs and the biggest market opportunities are not going to be picked up by companies because, nobody knows how, nobody knows what the problem actually is. So I think the state of the underlying science can be an important impetus. And there are examples of where science has to mature, right, at an academic level for about a decade or more in a new field. And then suddenly you see somehow it seems mature enough where an inflection point is reached and suddenly there's a lot of interest. Suddenly investors start talking about, shouldn't we put money into this because the field seems ready, if you will, for commercial development opportunities. So underlying science can be another big aspect. Generating demand and interest sometimes also comes from within the industry itself. So you could imagine, say, a large pharmaceutical company which has a special expertise and long history in, say, diabetes. Right? Companies like that are going to be going around and they're saying, we're looking for more interesting diabetes products because that's what we do. Right? And what that means is for a lot of small entrepreneurs is, hey, maybe we should go talk to this big company. Maybe we should form our own small company, work on our idea, right? Go to them, show them the prototype. See if they will work with us, see if they'll acquire us. Their interest is our opportunity as a small business, right? And if we walk in with our patents and our prototype, so maybe there's something we can do. Right? So that's another reason, I think, for biotech companies to go into a certain field, but not in others. Sometimes it's disruptive new technologies. Right. So, gosh, now suddenly there's a tool that allows us to do something that we couldn't do before. Let's use that tool, see where we go and what we get onto. Gene editing is one example, right? Cell therapies that allow us to cure leukemia and other kinds of cancers are a relatively recent development. Right, that's really enabled by disruptive new tools, and companies pick them up and say, maybe we can use this in our own field. So gene editing, for example, is being used both for medical applications, but it's also being used a lot by agricultural companies, right? Who say, well, I can use gene editing too. I can make a better salt-resistant cereal crop or something that's going to grow really well in certain areas and regions in the world. So that is another example, I think, of what sometimes drives technology direction and company decisions to go in a certain direction is suddenly they have a new tool. But artificial intelligence is another example. We see, a huge and very fast adoption of artificial intelligence tools in biomedicine. Well, and this has only been going on for about 3 years, but companies are popping up everywhere building their own business around a new technology platform, right, in the hope of feeding into the pipeline that then gets picked up by larger companies. So there are, I think, a range of reasons why companies may decide to go a certain direction, but all of which have to do with like various manifestations of how technology matures. Finally, well, there's also markets and geographic regions. And this is something that is being discussed a lot in biomedicine. Well, there are diseases that affect predominantly, say, people who live in the global south. What? And there are diseases that are very rare in rich markets like Europe and the United States, but that are very common in poor markets. That, I think, is a discussion that we can have. I will only point it out because it is so prominent in discussions about biopharmaceutical IP. People rightfully say, you know, for the longest time or for too long, I think the pace of biomedical innovation and the direction of biomedical innovation has been driven by rich countries and rich country diseases. Right? Even in the United States, still, the National Institutes of Health spends a lot of research money on cancer, what metabolic diseases, diabetes, obesity. Right? These are diseases that are very prevalent here. They're not quite as prevalent in other countries where people deal with different problems. But if that scenario manifests itself in the sense that, oh, companies are only developing diseases for rich people in the developed world, sooner or later, well, you know you're going to have a really big policy discussion on the international level, whether that system works for everyone. So it is well to be mindful that biotech, I think, has ambitions to be a global industry. And if I think science and private investment in healthcare and biomedical and biotechnology innovation is supposed to be sustainable for the future, it must also pick up, I think, scientific questions that don't just affect the developed world, but that affect people elsewhere. Right? And not just to serve these populations, but also to get them involved in participating in innovation. Maybe then I will stop. I will just say briefly, one thing we've learned from the COVID crisis is that the world really needs like a different and more serious commitment to a globalizing innovation, right? And globalizing the tools for producing solutions to, say, the next pandemic, or finding solutions for diseases that may be regional rather than global. That too, I think, will be a very important task. And IP can help can help build a solution there as well, because even like for purposes of what I just explained, the collaboration, the orderly transfer of technology is going to be just as important as in everything else we talked about. So if we want to move knowledge transfer and build research and scientific capacity in the global south, right, that too will not be possible without like orderly systems of law that create the right incentives and that allow companies from different regions of the world to collaborate, transfer their technology, and engage in cooperation in ways that make commercial sense.
Yeah.
David, do you have something to add? Or maybe, I don't know if somebody has a question, so please back to.
Yeah, I was just gonna, and I know we're far afield from the original question, but I think Hans is, all of his comments I think are really important as are the previous panelists. I mean, what we're really talking about is the function of the patent system to create an opportunity for sort of, bottom up, if you will, innovation, inclusive innovation, to create opportunities for market specialization, for the creation of new markets. The organizations and the companies represented in this panel create that foundational layer of technology, but the patent system allows us to share that technology broadly so that it does then breed follow-on innovation, follow-on investments, market sectors, product sectors, and again, going back to my earlier comments, we're trying to kind of look into the future and make sure that the technology is at a point where it can enable all these different opportunities, but it's really the function of the patent to create an incentive for those other opportunities to kind of take root. The other aspect of, I think, what Hans is talking about is, does the patent system actually function as an inclusive, innovation ecosystem, if you will? And one of the areas that we and WIPO and others are very focused on is making sure that our patent system is inclusive in the sense that it creates opportunities for women, people of color, underrepresented communities, underrepresented geographies, to Hans's point, underrepresented problems in need of a solution. That's the intent of the patent system. It doesn't always function as intended. So there's a lot of cooperation between companies and organizations like ours, the PTO, WIPO, and other offices throughout the world to make sure that different communities, different groups, do have full access to participating in the patent system. Of course, what's also important is that those opportunities exist within our venture capital community and all the different, elements or constituent parts of our innovation ecosystem. But that is really the potential of a patent system. And I think it's important to contrast that with either, what would the world look like if we didn't have functional patent rights? That's a very different model of innovation that is, in some respects, much more dependent on, large players, which in and of itself becomes an impediment to that sort of vision of inclusivity. Or, there's part of the conversation we often hear is that, well, trade secrets are a sufficient substitute for patent rights. And of course they're not, because the very nature of a trade secret requires that you kind of build a wall around the technology, whereas patents are really aimed at breaking down those walls and promoting the kind of market creation and collaboration that Hans was describing. So, but Joshua, I'll stop there, and maybe we can take on some of the other questions.
Thanks very much, Lori and Hans. I think that was a little bit of a tangent from what the question went, but a really important discussion and some very valuable points. So the next question, this looks at, I think for Lori and for John, is how do you approach the commercialization strategy for large tech patent portfolio? How do you approach other companies, the licensing agreements, and are there industry standards on royalties?
I can jump in on that one. Well, it's an interesting and timely question, I suppose, because in particular for Nokia, we have an enormous patent portfolio that's directed toward wireless communication technologies. But what you have found in the past, especially 5 years to 10 years, is you're starting to see a convergence, right, with wireless technologies being adopted in other industries. Let's take one example being the automotive industry. Heretofore, you didn't have the use of connectivity, wireless connectivity in automobiles. But now you're seeing, first you had the advent of emergency communications with some cars. Then you had the additional use of Wi-Fi within the car with connections to the internet. Now you're seeing electric vehicles that have almost exclusively large screens that allow for the adaptation of wireless communications to use video technology, to use back and forth signaling, where these automobiles can report damage issues. The automobile manufacturer can do over-the-air updates to the operating systems in the car. They can provide additional services that their customers can subscribe to using the wireless technology. So in the past, we had been consistently negotiating just with phone manufacturers for our wireless patent portfolio. Now, all of a sudden, we were moving into a new market and trying to license auto manufacturers because they were using the technology. And so, whereas before we had had consistent relationships with all of the with the phone manufacturers because we had dealt with them over a series of licenses and renewal cycles, and there's a rapport that had been built. Now we were dealing with an entirely new set of companies, which we didn't have relations with and which we had to go out and build relationships with. We had to explain to them the value of our technology in their products, how our technology was being used in their products, whereas they wouldn't probably have had the same understanding of our technology as some of the phone manufacturers would have because it's their industry. So we had to develop an entirely new protocol, and we had to really improve our selling points, if you want to look at it that way. We had to go out and really explain at a base level to the auto manufacturers why, how and why they were using our technology and what the value of it was to them, so that we could demonstrate their need for a license and their need for a license at the level and price points that we were suggesting to them. So I think that's an example of one of these areas. There are more of them coming out. Another one that I'm responsible for at my company is the multimedia licensing arm. And we're looking at several different areas there, but most prominently, you have over-the-top streamers, Netflix, Max, Disney Plus, Hulu, BritBox, all over the world. These companies have been making great use of video compression technology. Without video compression technology, there would be no way that they could even deliver their services. That video compression technology is standardized, and we are one of numerous companies that have contributed technology to those standards. And now we have a new licensing program where we're going to these over-the-top streamers and we're saying, okay, you're using this video compression technology that we helped standardize and we helped create. We need to talk about the compensation that you owe us as a patent holder. And so this is an entirely new set of people that we have to explain our story to, and it's maybe even more challenging there because this is now video technology, and they say, wait, Nokia, you're a wireless communications technology provider. You're not involved in the video realm. But we are, actually. We've always been. In fact, the original H.264 codec was built off of technology that Nokia had pioneered some 20 or more years ago. So it's definitely a challenge when you're entering these new markets. You have to have a team of individuals who are very personable and who are very good at explaining technology at a simple level, and then developing the relationships that are necessary to build a level of trust so that the potential licensee understands that you and can feel confident that you are not selling them an empty bag.
Right. And just to build on John's comments, I mean, this is where you do see, friction or tension, if you will, between different parts of an industry. When we're talking about patents, we're talking about, technology that's publicly available. If you're talking about standardized technologies, you part of your job, if you will, as a contributor to those technologies is proving the merit of those technologies, that in fact these are the best solutions available in the world to solve very challenging problems. And as John said, companies like ours are sort of known for the core cellular technology, but we tend to have among the most diverse technology portfolios in the world. So, when you're talking about entering a new market or even a pre-existing market with the device makers, it's not a question of whether these companies will use and leverage the technology. It's a question of whether they will pay for it, because the technology is out there, it's public. And no company, going back to some of the comments that Hans made, wants to be reliant on a court system to enforce your rights. Like that's the last resort, so to speak. You want these companies to come to the table and to be willing to negotiate a fair license. but getting them to the negotiating table really requires a strong functional patent system. So there's a lot of, ongoing tension, if you will, within these industries in terms of your ability as an R&D leader to actually, achieve the revenues necessary to sustain that leadership position. I think it's also worth noting that, the royalties that are typically paid by these companies are, pennies on the dollar in terms of what they earn in revenues. I mean, some of these companies are the most valuable companies in the world who are leveraging these technologies. And of course, when you talk about multimedia patents, patents, that are critical to the whole sort of emerging field of connected cars. I mean, you're really talking about transformational technologies that are critical to the ongoing competitiveness of different industry sectors. But even with that value proposition, it is a challenge to get these companies to the table and to negotiate license agreements. Even with our kind of long-standing licensees, every licensing negotiation is a battle. That's just, and that's, for folks like John who kind of live in the licensing world, that's just part of their day job is kind of understanding that you're going to be dealing with different industry players who would much prefer to use your technology for free rather than pay for it, even if that payment is, relatively modest compared with what they will ultimately earn in terms of revenue and market share. Joshua, I'll stop there.
Thank you. There's a sort of, I guess, on the opposite side of the licensing, we have a question from a student who's a tech transfer manager at a university. And they ask, how does, for a tech transfer person or someone who has a technology which they think one of your companies might want to license, how do they reach out to you and how do you work with professors and tech transfer offices on potential licensing? And I'll open this to whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll just briefly say that, at least from Nokia's point, we actually have a website portal designed specifically for that purpose. It's called, or at least it used to be called, I think it still is, called Invent with Nokia. And there we take information from people who have technologies or ideas or projects that they think might be particularly valuable to us, or with whom they think we might be a great partner to work with. And we have a team of people inside who are tasked with evaluating those communications that come in. And then if we think it's something that seems sensible, that we could partner with the person, or that we might want to make use of the technology and consider acquiring it or investing even in the company, then we'll reach out to that company. But we do that by way of a web portal that allows people to come to us.
Thank you, John. I see Christina put that in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, and that, I think that's a really good example, but I'm aware, of other companies like Nokia who do similar things, right? They will have portals. They will, sometimes it works both directions, right? So the company may announce the availability of some technology available for licensing to others. And they may do it the other way around as well, where they say, we are open, right? If you have a proposition for us, if you have a nifty idea, if you want to come and show us your prototype or whatever the technology may be, right? You can contact so-and-so and we'll do it. So that's one way of doing it. There are many other ways. I think a lot of universities and, academic centers are instituting, offices inside the university where you can go also as a point of contact. They may make introductions to investors. They may even teach academic scientists on, what it's like to farm a company. How do you do this, right? Write a business plan. Where might you find investors? So there are places where you can find advice, but they're scattered all over the place. A good start is at the academic institution if the idea comes out of academia. Another example is I'm Skyping in or Zooming in from the Bio International Convention, what I told you earlier. I work for BIO, the trade association. And one thing we do is once a year, we do a huge trade show. This year it's in San Diego, so I'm here right now. And as part of our 4-day convention, there are 18,000 people here. And one big set of activities that's actually happening is partnering meetings. So they said we have a computer system where people sign up, and the system has, I think, set up 80,000 meetings over the course of 5 days, where like thousands of people meet for like 20 minutes with each other to pitch technology or talk about business opportunities where they could partner up. So that would be another way of finding both partners or investors and the like. You can look inside your own technology space for organizations whose business it is to facilitate economic development. There are state organized resources available as well. Right? In many places, you will find either local or national governments that spend money on technology incubators. Right? They want to make it easier for small businesses to farm, to find a home, to start operations. There are grants. So there's public money, investment money that companies that haven't yet been able to find a private investor, where companies can get grants. There's no one easy way to find money, no one easy way to find partners. But the best advice I would give is to say, find other entrepreneurs or business people who've been there, who've done it. That's how I find people get into the business. That's how I find people form their own little biotech companies. When I ask them, how do you do it? Most of them will say, I met other people who've done it. And they were mentored by entrepreneurs who were already there. So that's one, I think, a very common way that I'm aware of where companies say, how do we get off the ground? Where do we find technology to commercialize, and how does it fit together with our own maybe history as academic researchers? I don't know. David, I know that, large pharma companies are also starting initiatives for generating new ideas and generating new small companies. Isn't that right, David?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, even larger companies may have venture capital type arrangements where they could be looking for business partners. And one other thing to think about is the patent system itself. So patents are published, the applications, and then the patents themselves. And in an area like biopharmaceuticals, people are looking at the patents and they can see who is working in particular areas, or especially for universities, or people see at conferences that professors at universities are working in different areas. And there are a lot of ways when the patent system is used instead of trade secrets, where people can understand a lot more of what other people are researching and can pursue business opportunities through that.
Thank you. Okay, so next question. How much time and resources are spent defending patent rights in your respective companies? If you ever choose not to defend a patent because it's cost prohibitive to your organization, and I guess not necessarily in the question, but I think what we're talking about a little bit is, when do you choose not to enforce a right? There's a lot of talk internationally about SMEs and patents there, and I think we can maybe shed some light on that.
Yeah, so again, I'll start and then others should weigh in. As I said earlier, we're not talking about enforcing, individual patents through licensing. We license at a portfolio level. That portfolio can vary if you're talking about different industry sectors, as John was alluding to, but there's obviously decisions that are made in terms of which technologies are included within a portfolio. But again, it's, we're talking about large groupings of patents. I do, though, Joshua, want to talk a little bit about your comment about, licensing at the so-called SME level, because we hear this this narrative, if you will, in different parts of the world that patents and patent licensing, is a burden to startup activity. It's in small businesses, that it's an impediment to access to innovation, access to, or opportunities for market growth, creating a new product, what have you. Not surprisingly, Qualcomm views that issue very differently. I mean, we again view our role as enabling an ecosystem, not only by doing the advanced R&D that enables that startup economy, but creating licensing mechanisms, efficient licensing mechanisms that overcome, barriers that might otherwise exist in terms of accessing technology. And for us, at least, we do not, it is not our practice to, go after small businesses and try to, negotiate licensing agreements with every company that may be leveraging our technology. Really, to the contrary, the way the industry has evolved over the years, licensing activity has concentrated with those major implementers, if you will, of the technology. For cellular, it's again the big mobile device makers. As John was describing, we're starting to see emerging licensing practices around automobile makers. But it's a myth, and I think a really unfortunate myth, this notion that as creators of the technology, that we're attempting to target every single company or part of the ecosystem that might be benefiting from that technology. That's really not the licensing model, the industry practice at all. And candidly, it would not be efficient for us to engage in those kinds of practices. I mean, we are trying to make decisions every day about how do we most efficiently and effectively license our portfolio at a level, an industry level that makes sense. And it rarely makes sense to target, the so-called SME community. So that may not be true for every company. Obviously, there are lots of different licensing models, but for the kind of large R&D players like Qualcomm, at least, it's really I think an unfortunate myth that SMEs are burdened or somehow negatively affected by patent licensing. And I think, unfortunately, that's a myth that's sometimes perpetuated by larger commercial interests who see a weakening of the patent system as a means of reducing their own potential royalty obligations or liability. So in any event, I would just treat that narrative with a bit of a grain of salt. And as with every narrative that exists around the patent system, look for the evidence. And if there is no evidence, then question what motivations may be driving some of that rhetoric.
Yeah, I think there was an unfortunate development in the United States. Boy, what was it? Probably about 10 years ago or so at this point, maybe even a little bit more than that, where you had a small non-practicing entity patent holder in the Wi-Fi space who began blanketing the industry with lawsuits against every mom and pop user of Wi-Fi routers. So your local coffee shop down on the corner that offered Wi-Fi in its premises. This company that had patents that they believed read on Wi-Fi, instead of going and suing the manufacturers of the products that were being used in all of those locations, chose blanket fire out hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits against the actual users of the technology, who really had no idea about how the technology worked or or any idea that they were infringing. But because under the U.S. patent law, they were actually using the technology, they theoretically could have been on the hook for infringement. And the way that this NPE operated was it was firing off all of these demand letters, and it was seeking sort of a nuisance value settlement from each one of these companies. And the mom and pop coffee shop operator down on the corner, it was cheaper for them to pay the nuisance settlement than to actually try to defend the lawsuit because litigation and legal fees in the United States are so high. This campaign attracted an outsized amount of attention among lawmakers and other policymakers in the United States, and it spawned what we call the patent troll narrative, where it became almost all holders of patents became painted with this terrible patent troll moniker that everyone was just out to monetize their IP at the expense of the small person, and patent holders were abusing the system. And it was really just a result of this one campaign by one bad actor. And it has had a terrible effect that we're still fighting today in the United States in policy circles about how patent holders are allegedly just using their patents to extract unnecessary and unwarranted gains from small entities like Lori described. And so now there's this great concern about how small entities could get abused by the patent system. But in truth, large patent holders like Qualcomm or Nokia or others, we have no incentive to go after the small patent or the small user of the technology because it's not cost effective. And we have no desire to squash their use of our products either, because it makes no sense. We want people to use our technology. That's why we contribute it to standards, because the more people that are using the technology, the greater there is a chance for them to develop into large revenue producing companies that will help us with our royalties and contribute to the next cycle of the technology.
Yeah.
So that's an unfortunate development that took place and that still is impacting policy circles and discourse in patent law today. One bad actor has really caused a lot of trouble for the rest of the innovation industry.
Yeah, and just one other point I think that's worth making, just to build on John's comments. There has been a tremendous amount of research in the US, Europe, I'm sure other parts of the world, to try to quantify the extent to which that there is a so-called patent troll problem, if there is a pervasive practice of leveraging patent rights to disadvantage or abuse, whatever terminology you want to use, smaller companies. And invariably the conclusion of that research is that, as John pointed out, to the extent that these types of activities are happening, they are outlier type activities. These are not pervasive practices at all. And again, if you look at the value that's created through a patent-enabled technological development licensing ecosystem, it far the benefits far exceed any kind of problems that we see in the system with individual players trying to game the system. And by the way, patent rights are legal instruments, and every dimension of our legal system has opportunities for abuse, opportunities for gamesmanship. That is just the nature of a legal system, unfortunately. But again, to go back to John's comments, what this narrative has perpetuated is a kind of constant onslaught of sort of anti-patent rhetoric, anti-patent policy that we've been dealing with now for 20 years in the United States, and probably the same amount of time in Europe and other markets. And that shift in the policy landscape around intellectual property rights has a real danger of chilling R&D investments, because for companies like ours, if the patent system doesn't function as intended, we can't justify these R&D investments. So that's what's at stake. And I think it's important to keep those kind of broader objectives, if you will, in mind as we engage in a conversation around, how do we improve the patent system, which is absolutely a legitimate conversation to have, but we need to make sure that our policy is grounded in fact and empirical data and not in rhetoric or in anecdote, of an individual bad player.
So it may pay to talk about a different way on the enforcement from the people who are relying on IP as the basis for their R&D and developing products over time. In the biopharma space, I mentioned a little bit about what happens at the end of the patent life. We have regulatory systems, and they're throughout the world, that allow for generic products. And a generic product is a product that doesn't do all the studies I mentioned. They can come on the market saying they are the same as the brand product, and they behave the same way in the blood. So all the studies are part of that. They're attributed, and the company can rely on the brand studies as the basis for their own approval. In the US, we have a system where a generic company can say, I actually want to get on the market before patent expiration because I think my product won't infringe your patents or the patents are invalid. Well, the brand company is then, under the system, allowed to sue at that point because they want to make sure that they have a chance to defend their patent rights, show they're valid, and would be infringed by the product. And there's a lot of litigation, and you could see pharmaceutical litigation around the world. And in the US, this is common because it's part of a system that allows people to challenge the patents and the brands to enforce them. And it's similar in the biologic space as well. And brand companies can be enforcing against other ones if they think they're infringing the patent by a different molecule, but maybe they're infringing some of the patents as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for people to enforce their rights, as Lori said, the legal rights that they have to be able to defend their IP as the basis for developing their businesses and getting products to patients.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So with the abundance of new discoveries in the biotech space, major players are becoming more attentive to the cost benefits of specific drugs, devices, and procedures. The increased scrutiny could impact the virtuous cycle where funds from accessible intellectual property can finance new discoveries. So here's the question. With this pressure on individual research projects due to economic evaluation and development level, how can companies strategically navigate this environment?
I don't think, maybe I'll take a first quick crack at this. I think it's to bring this up, I think it's a really important question, certainly in our space, right? And there's a lot of interest in not just like bringing innovation forward and getting it to the market, but also then making it accessible at affordable prices. And with that, I mean, at prices that health systems, governments, payers, and so on are willing to pay. Right. So pricing has been, I think, an ongoing debate in the biopharmaceutical space that really has affected lots of aspects of our business, including the way people look at intellectual property. There's too much in this question for me to be able to answer. I will pick up only one quick aspect, and that is before you can worry about how to price a new product, a new drug, for example, you must first have one to begin with, right? And with the important role that patents and IP play in the generation of this technology, right, and facilitating the development and making it possible that these products exist in the first place, and then you can worry about how to price them. So if you're focused on the early stage of development before there is a product, I can tell you with certainty that it is poisonous. But at that stage of research and development, to start talking prematurely about to companies and say, well, if you develop a product, right, if you're successful against the odds, if you bring a product to market in 5 years or whenever you're ready, if you're lucky enough, right, if all that happens, then we want your product to be priced a certain way. We want it to look a certain way. We want it to be distributed a certain way. What policymakers have expectations of biotech companies that they may exceed, like to all these policy desires and proposals. But it is incredibly destructive, right, to at an early stage of development to make commercial demands for a product that doesn't yet exist, to make commercial demands for a product where the developer doesn't yet know how exactly the product is going to work, look, and function. So I've seen companies being approached, right, both in the United States and in foreign countries where governments and regulators and lawmakers have had like these demands, right? They want some control over the kinds of products that are in development in order to steer like what they're going to look like when they're mature, these products. That is very toxic, I think, for companies to do, because at the end of the day, businesses have to find ways to deal with risk. Right? There are so many unknowns in speculative technologies that you want to bring forward that once you start piling on more and more risk, right, and more imponderables and more things that you won't be able to predict, that at some point there's a tipping point and companies say, you know, I would rather invest my money in something else because there's just too much risk. And the question about the demands on, you know, what's the value of the product, how will it be priced if it gets to the market, is in effect really just another form of risk that gets put into the development program where the developing company just doesn't know what they're going to be facing after they've spent all their money. Right. So in the spirit of predictability, companies can manage risk as long as it's predictable. Right. But what companies have a really big problem dealing with is changing the rules of the game along the way, or dealing with like ambiguity where you don't know, you know, what the situation will be if you're successful against the odds after you've spent all your money. David, do you have maybe an additional thought on that?
Yeah. No, I mean, companies are going to be looking to, you know, get the best products out there and they're going to want IP protection for it, but they have to navigate whatever the regulatory system and other parts of the healthcare system are at play at any given time.
And so you can worry about what these products look like, how they're going to be distributed, and how they're priced once you have them. Well, it gets so much harder if you worry about these things before these products even exist. That, I think, is very hard for companies to deal with.
Hey, thank you, Hans. Thank you, David, Rory, and John. It was a great session as always.